Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you about some of the most important things in chess: attack and defense. Of course, we all like to attack because it's a lot of fun, a lot more fun than being on the defensive. Nevertheless, at times it's unavoidable to need to defend. At the same go, I have to say that while attack is fun, it by no means guarantees success all the time. In this lesson, I would like to share you some of my own experiences when my opponents just decided to attack me because they wanted to, not because it was justified by the position. Well, our first example is from the 2004 Chess Olympiad, where I had the black pieces in this position, and I'll flip the board at this moment. And I had the black pieces, and my opponent chose a rare variation against the Sicilian by playing b3 early on and the bishop on b2 instead of the standard open Sicilian. So in this position, having the two knights on the king's side, she continued by playing knight to f5. The bishop went back to f8. I didn't want to allow the trade. And now she brought the queen to e3, signaling that the queen wants to get near my king as well. And here, a very important move, I centralized my knight on d4 and forcing a trade of at least a pair of minor pieces. Of course, here she could trade with either knight or the bishop, but considering the relative closeness of the position, she chose to trade with the bishop, thinking that if instead she would trade with one of the knights, then after my recapture, the bishop on b2 would be buried anyway. And now she continued with queen to g5, kind of trying to scare me, attack me. But in all reality, this is not a dangerous attack. And that is the whole point I'd like to get across in this lesson, that just because a couple of your opponent's pieces appear right around or in front of your king, it's not a reason to panic and to be afraid. It's just a reason to be careful and very alert against the threats. Because, of course, threats directed against your king are typically a lot more dangerous or important than other threats against weak pawns or squares. So here, white just has created a pin on the g file, and typically you want to get out of pins. Not that immediately, let's say, a check with the knight moving to h6 would be that dangerous, but nevertheless it's much healthier to move out of such pins with the king to h8. And in this position, my opponent moved her queen back to h4, again trying to put it on the same file with my king, but more importantly, I think her idea is to clear the g5 square for her knight. For example, if I would respond right now by playing d5, then knight g5 would be a good response for white. Let's go back to the position after queen h4, and here I played bishop to c8. Another typical idea that I suggest when you are under attack, try to trade pieces, especially the ones that are instrumental in your opponent's attack. For example, the rook in the corner is not an active participant of the attack. On the other hand, the knight on f5 is. For example, if my opponent would have proceeded with knight to g5, I planned to trade my bishop for the knight, and then immediately follow up by pushing my pawn to d5 with the idea to further advance with my pawn to e4. As you can see, my knight on f6 solidly protects the h7 pawn, which is crucial because white is putting dual pressure on that pawn by the queen and the knight. And yet we can see the knight is rock solid on f6. It cannot be chased out or traded because white does not have a dark squared bishop, does not have a second knight, and none of the pawns are able to attack it in the foreseeable future. Again, let's go back to the game, and in this position, after I went back to c8 with my bishop, my opponent proceeded with another attacking move, playing g4. The idea is to try to chase my knight away from f6. And here, I responded by moving my queen to d8. By putting my queen on the same diagonal with the white queen, at times I may have opportunities to offer an exchange of queens after moving my knight away. Also, it prevents ideas of white, such as moving the knight to h6, which would be possible due to the fact that the pawn on g7 is busy guarding the knight to f6. So also by moving my queen to d8, I'm protecting my knight on f6 a second time. And white continued by pushing the pawn up to g5, and I retreated my knight to g8. It's important also to mention that moving my knight to a more central place, in this case to d7, would be an error because my opponent could answer with bishop c4 all of a sudden, activating the bishop by putting pressure on the pawn on f7, and I would face an unpleasant situation. I have to mention that the position after retreating the knight to g8 looks a little weird by having all of my pieces on the back rank. In fact, the only two pieces that are reversed compared to their initial position is my king and rook. All my other pieces, of course other than pawns, are back to their initial positions. Typically, this is not a good sign. However, in this particular case, is not a reason to worry, because very soon I'll have an opportunity to chase back my opponent's attacking pieces and reactivate my own. At the same time, I do have the pair of bishops, which is a permanent or at least a long-term situation, and also I have some space advantage in the center. My opponent continued with king to h2, clearing the g1 square for one of the rooks to appear there. And now I played g6, attacking my opponent's knight. And this was a crucial moment of the game because my opponent had to choose between retreating the knight to g3, when I have a very comfortable position, for example, after playing bishop e7 and then opening up the position with f6, or doing what she did, which was super risky and with all reality objectively incorrect. She played rook to e2, provoking for me to accept the sacrifice of the knight and trying to open the diagonal of this bishop. Now, if my opponent would actually get to push up her pawn to f6 and indeed open up that diagonal for the bishop and give support to the queen's attack on the pawn on h7, it would really look scary for black. On one hand, how to handle the checkmate threat on h7, and on the other hand, my knight and bishop would get paralyzed if indeed that white pawn would get to f6. However, finding the correct move in this position, playing f7 to f6 myself, all of a sudden takes all the power away from white's attack. And being up a bishop, objectively, this is a winning position. Let me show you how the game ended. My opponent played g6, which is a very logical move, creating an immediate checkmate threat, but I have numerous ways to deal with that threat. I chose to activate my rook that was sleeping so far that now all of a sudden is active and alive and protects against the checkmate threat on h7. My opponent responded by moving the rook to e1. I brought another piece to defend, came bishop to c4, and I grabbed the pawn on f5, although pushing the pawn up to d5 was also a very good choice. I captured the pawn, and the game lasted just a couple of more moves. My opponent grabbed the pawn on f6, and I got the pawn on g6, knight h4, bishop g7, and now we can see the complete retreat of the white pieces, and black is up a bishop, and white resigned on the following move. After this example, let's move on to another game of mine that I played at that very same Olympiad just 2 days later against Skripchenko representing France. And this was the position, and then again I'll try to flip the board. In this position, it was her turn, and the pawn on b2 is hanging at the moment. And she decided to immediately start an attack. And again, I don't have a weakness on the king's side, so it's not really a justified attack, I believe. She responded here by playing rook to f3, with the idea that if I would capture the pawn on b2, she would play bishop to d4 and create some immediate tactical threats connected to discovery. For example, if I would move my queen to g6, that would be quite bad because rook g3 would immediately come and then capture on g7. Or after queen h6, white could play rook h3, and if queen takes pawn, then knight e2, discovery, attacking the queen and the rook at the same time. Let's go back again. The position after rook f3. After one more time, rook captures b2 and bishop d4. Black's best choice would be to play e5. But even after that, white would have the opportunity either to play knight d5 immediately, or perhaps even better, capture the pawn on e5 with a double attack on my queen, and after queen h6, then play knight d5 and create a discovered attack again on my rook and bishop with again slightly favorable position for white. So after rook f3, I decided to play differently and play e5, prevent any and all of those bishop d4 ideas that my opponent had. Also, at the same time, activate my own bishop and create a threat of a pin of playing bishop to g4. If in this position my opponent would play f5 to try to close down the diagonal of my bishop, then I planned already to capture the pawn on b2, as white no longer has the option to play bishop to d4. And then after rook g3, which has a threat of bishop to g5, then not h6, which is the most natural looking move, because then white could proceed with queen c1, creating a double attack. On one hand, attacking the rook, and then if the rook would move away, then bishop could capture on h6 using the pin. Let's go back again to the position after f5 and rook b2 and rook g3. Here, instead of h6, I planned to play simply d5, clearing an escape route for my queen after bishop g5. Let's go back to the game continuation. After e5, my opponent captured my pawn on e5, forcing my queen to recapture as it's a double attack, and she finally got to put her bishop on d4. However, having a pair of bishops, the opening of the position, is not something for me to be feared of. Came queen e6, and here my opponent played again very aggressively, attacking with rook g3. If instead she would have played a more solid b3, protecting the pawn, that would have given me the time to, for example, chase away the bishop and activate my own dark squared bishop, with quite a pleasant position for black. Again, the game instead in this position continued with rook to g3, immediately putting pressure on g7. And here I chose to play f6, although bishop f6 came into consideration as well. I preferred to keep both my bishops on the board. And this is the moment where my opponent, I think, went overboard and got carried away with her attack. She should have played a defensive move to protect the pawn on b2. Instead, she continued by playing queen h5 and giving up on that pawn. Now the white knight does not have a good discovery because it cannot attack anything else but the rook, and having only a single attack on one single piece is not terribly dangerous. Here she continued with rook h3, attacking the pawn on h7, but that is easy to defend against, h6, and now the rook went back again to g3. And here I played rook f7, a bit defensive move on the g7 square. I could have right away taken the pawn on c2 as well. And here she used the pin by capturing the pawn on h6. But white has no immediate threat at this moment, so I continued with c5, chasing the bishop back. If here the bishop would retreat to e3, that would allow me to play queen e5, which in all reality is a double attack, because on one hand I'm attacking the knight directly, and also I'm threatening to capture the rook on g3 to unpin my g7 pawn and then capture the queen. Now, after bishop f4, even though it seems that now the rook protects the knight on c3, I would still capture that knight on c3, because after rook captures, then pawn captures, and I would come out ahead. Let's go back again to the game position. After c5, my opponent responded with bishop to f2. And here it's safe now to capture the pawn on c2, again threatening to capture the knight on c3. And here white made another mistake. The only move to stay in the game would have been to defend the knight with the second rook on c1, but of course, being up a pawn, having pair of bishops, black would have a clearly better position already anyway. Nevertheless, the game move, knight to d5, loses immediately because it allows a cute tactic. I played queen e5, attacking both rooks. The rook in the corner, of course, is under direct fire right now. And after the rook moved to c1, I had a very nice combination. I could play immediately queen takes g3, although that would not result in much of a gain, only a little pawn. After queen takes, bishop takes, and now my rook is hanging. And of course the white queen protects the rook on c1 in the meantime, so the best I can do is give up my rook for the pawn, and at the end of the day have 2 extra pawns, but white may win one of them back and get excellent drawing chances considering the opposite colored bishops left on the board. Much better was what I chose to do here, and that is first sacrifice the rook for the bishop, and if king would take, then queen takes, and then I'll be a bishop ahead. My opponent in this position did not capture the rook, but instead connected her rooks on c3, and then I simply protected my rook on f2, and the game ended in just a few moves. After rook e3, pawn got captured, h3, check, king h2, rook a1, the tables got turned, now the attack is in black's hands, rook g6, check, king g3, and white resigned after rook a2. And let's see finally the jewel of the week. Okay, here we go. This is a beautiful, beautiful example of art in chess. In this position, black seems to have a very dangerous attack, in fact threatening to checkmate along the h-file on the following move. It's white to move and checkmate in 6 moves. Try to sit back, relax, figure out the solution for yourself before you listen further and look at the solution. The brilliant answer is putting white's queen in double attack. Amazing move. If now the bishop captures, then it's really easy. Check and checkmate just in 2 more moves. But what happens if instead the black king captures? Well, then it's a bit trickier and longer. Then bishop takes with a check. Of course, white must make all forceful moves, otherwise black would be the one checkmating first. And if king c5, b4, king c6, bishop check, and rook check, and finally bishop checkmates on c4. What a brilliant, brilliant end. And let's see one more time. If after queen d5, king takes, bishop takes, if the black king now goes back to c6, not to c5, then very similar, just in a different order of moves. b4, king d5, check, king e6, and the same bishop checkmate ends. Well, I hope you enjoyed this beautiful puzzle, and of course, hopefully you won't be as fearful, if you were at all, in the future of attacks. An attack is just part of the game. It does not necessarily mean that it will succeed. Defense, of course, has its strengths, and just you have to make sure you need to find some accurate defensive moves. Thank you for listening, and we'll get back to this subject again. Take care until next week.